Women's liberation is not just political, okay? And so when we are talking about what it means to be an unpunishable woman, we are not just talking about political liberation. And over the last few days, I've really been thinking about this, and I wanted to share some key things about what it actually means to be an unpunishable woman and what this platform, this thinking platform, is designed for, okay? Because I believe there's a type of liberation that is available to every woman today. Okay, it is relative to each woman, but it's a type of liberation that is available to every woman today, regardless of whether society changes tomorrow, next month, or next year. Now, here's the thing, being an unpunishable woman, and I'm going to kind of share with you now what that really means, is it doesn't replace structural change. Okay, it asks a different question of us as women. How do I become internally free? And this is really important overall when it comes to any of the content that you consume across the Unpunishable Woman channels. It is not solely about political liberation. Okay, it is about how we as women become internally free. Internally free. So the first step here is self-authority. You would have heard me talk about this a number of times. Who has the authority to author your life? Okay, most women are taught that they have to outsource authority, and this happens from girlhood onwards. Now, there's a number of authorities that are external to us that emerge. The first one, of course, is the family system. Okay, the family system is the first usual authority that as a young woman, as a girl, you will be taught to defer your thinking to, your trust to, and the decisions that you're making. Parents, religion, culture, politics, partners, algorithms, because remember, social media is now a system of power, public opinion, experts. Okay, these are the places now that young women in particular are being taught to defer authority to. And the thing is that we have to remember, and this is like a little diagram here, we're usually in the center, so to speak, and then you've got all of these other authorities orbiting us, essentially. And actually, depending on what you've been taught, you might not be the center of your life. You might be orbiting any one or more of these other types of authority, okay? And this is where the good woman contract comes into play. Because actually what most women are taught is that good women seek permission. Good women don't trust themselves. Good women will be validated by these external authorities. Good women accept someone else's interpretation of who they are. The humble woman, right? No. And we have to be really aware of this good woman contract and how it emerges usually in the decisions that we're making in our life. The other thing as well that becomes really obvious as you move into adulthood psychologically, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, is something called interpretive dominance. That is when other people decide and project your motives, your identity, your psychology, and your intentions. We live in a world where interpretive dominance, okay, is very, very common. And we see it playing out live on social media every single day. And so when you are reclaiming your authority, relocating your authority as a woman, you are refusing to surrender authorship of your own mind, your own decisions, and your body, and the choices that you make around, for example, your body. And this is a fundamental practice. One of the things that I want to really emphasize to you is that being an unpunishable woman, it is not an affirmation. It is not a slogan. It's not a meme, right? It's not a phrase that you just have on your mobile phone screensaver that titillates you. No, it is a developmental practice. It is a habit. You exercise the muscle of being an unpunishable woman. Now, the way that looks to you, of course, will differ depending upon your life and your circumstances. But it is a practice, and it begins by relocating that authority that you have over your identity. Now, the thing to be aware of when it comes to authority is that a lot of the time, and look, the truth is, a lot of my work in the early months when I started sharing this publicly online, a lot of my work did indeed, and still does in some ways when it's needed, focuses on male authority and the rejection of unearned male authority, whether it's systemic or interpersonal for women. Okay. And that is true. That is often needed, and it's often a starting point for many women. But unearned male authority is not the only type of authority that we need to relocate and reclaim. Like I said, if we go back, you can see there's these other types of authority, okay? And that also includes female authority. Okay, that includes rejecting and not cognitively surrendering and submitting to the projected authority of other women, socially, offline, or indeed online. An unpunishable woman becomes the primary author, okay, of her own life. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter who it is. You become the primary author of your own thinking. And this is critical for you to understand. The entire point is not to tell you what to think. No framework should tell you what to think, right? It's about enabling you in how you think. That's the important piece. That doesn't mean you have to think the same thing as everybody else, right? It's about knowing how to think for yourself, and knowing that you have the right to decide what you think. It doesn't matter what the external authorities tell you should believe and why you should believe it. You want to be exercising, practicing that muscle of thinking for yourself. Now that starts by reclaiming and relocating your authority as an adult woman. The next kind of habit or practice that I often encourage women to cultivate, right, to develop, is psychological adulthood. Okay, because once you've relocated authority, you have to start thinking, okay, so now that authority belongs to me. How do I carry it? How do I move forward with it, right? And so here's the things to be aware of. There's legal adulthood, which varies from country to country and place to place in the world. Okay, there's even biological adulthood, right? The medical field, generally speaking, will have its own parameters for deciding, when a skeleton, for example, is an adult one versus a child one, a minor one. Those are types of adulthood, but psychological adulthood, this is something that I've spoken about ever since I started sharing ideas publicly. It is critical that as women, we develop psychological adulthood. That's about emotional maturity, critical thinking skills, right? It's about accepting responsibility for our own life. It's about tolerating uncertainty, because that's a part of adult life. Emotional regulation, accepting consequences. And by the way, consequences can be across the spectrum, good, bad, neutral even. Trusting yourself when you've relocated the authority to make certain decisions, and then you trust yourself to navigate the consequences, okay? Learning to live without constant external reassurance, approval, validation, and thinking independently. Now, I understand that this can be quite challenging for a number of reasons. We are conditioned and programmed and often raised in a culture as women to actually sometimes remain quite childlike, mentally and emotionally. Okay? And also, when I think about thinking independently, I know certainly from my religious upbringing, one of the things that's often said about Eve is that the reason why she sinned and sin entered into the world is because she was thinking independently. That's what I was taught growing up. And so actually, when you as an adult woman begin to relocate authority and move into psychological adulthood on purpose, yes, you do think independently. Now, does that mean that all pre-existing beliefs and thinking are useless, futile? No. However, you should know how you got to a certain belief. You should know how and why you are making certain decisions. And that requires you often to think independently of the status quo or established thinking. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no sin in it. Right? Because the thing is, freedom without maturity becomes impulsiveness. Authority without adulthood becomes ego. And that's why I'm always encouraging women to move into psychological adulthood. And that is rocky. It's a bit like the stock market going up and down. It's a bit like actually flying on a plane during turbulence. But the turbulence itself is not a sign that you're doing something wrong or you're going in the wrong direction. That is when you learn to regulate yourself emotionally to be able to navigate that turbulent weather that comes about, okay? When I think about this, I often think about turbulence and when you're on a plane, right? And that pilot knows what's happening, right? The plane has been engineered and constructed in a certain way. And so it's about holding. And that's what we have to learn how to do as a woman who is moving into psychological adulthood. It's about being able to navigate the weather without losing yourself, right? And without being taken here, there, and everywhere when there's some pressure, when there's resistance, when there's conflict, when there's pushback, when there's potential punishment, whether that's social, financial, emotional, whatever it might well be, okay? Psychological adulthood teaches you how to use your freedom. The third element is ethical agency. This is also a core part of being an unpunishable woman. What kind of person will I choose to become? Yeah, because agency is more than just choice. Agency does involve responsibility, okay? And so it's about how do I exercise my personal power? Because we all have personal power, okay? How do I treat people? What standards do I hold myself to? This is very interesting because, of course, a lot of my content, I do talk about how women navigate human relationships, whether it's friendships, whether it's relationships with people that they're attracted to. This is where this really comes to. What standards do I hold myself to when it comes to navigating relationships and friendships, when it comes to choosing people or walking away? Okay? What responsibilities accompany freedom? This is an area, for example, when I'm training women around money. You know, a lot of women do struggle because, of course, you've been raised and nurtured to believe that money comes from and through men. And so a lot of women have a rescue fantasy. They have a rescue fantasy about life being easier, softer, and smoother if they had a male partner. When in actual fact, the evidence doesn't show that that's a guarantee. But within this, as an adult woman, okay, freedom and this type of agency comes with responsibilities, one of which is to look after ourselves financially. Now, you might be wondering, why are you talking about this, Ashanti? Well, at this point, I have thousands of comments, hundreds of DMs and emails that I comb through. And I know that this is an established belief for a lot of women of all ages. I've personally coached and trained women over the years. This is a belief that belongs, that is actually creates this sense of belonging in society in certain cultures, right? And so when women find themselves sometimes for the first time after a divorce, a separation, or the ending of a long-term relationship, or maybe you've been providing for yourself, maybe even some children for years, and it is onerous. Yeah, it's a heavy burden at times. You're aware of the risk factor that you've only got yourself to rely on. You've only got one income to rely on. I get it. That's been my life, right? And so you can start to think to yourself, life would be easier. But here's where you get the opportunity to step up into your own life. And this is where I have to remind you, I know people that, well, the cost of living has gone up. The economy is hard. This is what we talk about every Friday on the single woman economy. So I understand that. However, within this, we have the opportunity, okay, to really step up for ourselves in our own lives and think, okay, what do I as an adult woman want? And what steps am I going to take to get that thing, whatever it might be? And then at this point, I think it is critical for me to mention to you that, look, learning to hold yourself responsible, learning about ethical agency, okay, does not mean that you are ignoring structural oppression, injustice, and inequality. It's not the same thing. There is a type of liberation that is internal, that is personal, that you can absolutely realize, discover, experience. And so thinking in this way does not mean that you are living in Lula land and ignoring the very real systemic issues that exist. But women's liberation goes beyond political liberation. And ethical agency is a part of that as well. Okay? Agency requires accepting that every human being, regardless of gender, okay? Regardless of gender, it is beneficial to move into a type of maturity, into healthy behaviors. That is a part of being an adult woman. And being a woman does not make you morally superior to men. I understand that this is a sticking point, but I must say it is an important piece. It's a very important piece for you to be able to be self-reflective, to decide who you want to become and what you want out of your own life. All right. And so you are not outsourcing, okay? Ethical agency really means that you refuse to outsource your morality, whatever that morality looks like to you, because I understand morality is a tricky word. It's a tricky word, but your sense of right and wrong, okay, to an identity group. This is very important. It's very, very important. Okay, especially when you are developing as a young woman in the world that we're living in today. Because ultimately, our character and our personality impacts how we show up in the world and what we receive in return and how we interact with people. It does. Okay, and so this is something that when we're in the training groups that we really, really think about. So the Unpunishable Woman, okay, is not an identity. It's not an affirmation or a slogan. It's a practice. It requires habitual practice. It's something I have to do every single day, right? Self-authority, psychological adulthood, ethical agency, right? You're practicing this. It's not a feel-good thing, although sometimes it might feel good, right? It might feel good sometimes, but actually sometimes it doesn't, by the way. When you have to move into psychological adulthood, that doesn't always feel good. It's not always easy to do. It can be easier sometimes to defer your authority to other people because you don't want to make a decision for yourself. Maybe you're worried or scared or anxious, or you haven't had a lot of practice in making your own decisions and living through the consequences of those decisions. So this isn't easy. There are times where you may not be particularly inclined to use your agency in an ethical way because you're human, right? But this is the reality of being an unpunishable woman. It is a posture, it is a practice, it is a habit. So that's what I wanted to share in this video. Now, of course, there are always invisible contracts, right, that are trying to restrict and contain us so that we do not become internally free. Yeah. And so that is why I created the Invisible Contract Audit Workbook. So you can work through these invisible contracts personally and reflect on the ones that are governing your life right now. Now you can access that somewhere in the description box.